Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. This is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while navigating the uncertainties and complexities of the modern age. My name is Brett Kane, and I'm going to be your host on this journey, and together we're going to have a multidisciplinary conversation with a wide variety of presenters who each hold a piece to this puzzle. This often brings us into dialogue with spiritual teachers, somatic therapists, artists, environmentalists, activists, pretty much anybody who I feel is truly bringing this quality of aliveness to their work in the world. And one of the perennial themes that I hope to cover on this show is how we can squarely face the mounting climate crisis that we're facing as a global population. Not only do I want to explore how we can turn toward this massive predicament, but I also want to explore how we can do this in a way that opens us up to greater degrees of creativity, awareness, and compassion. I truly feel that if we engage with this properly, we can utilize this moment in history as a jumping off platform into a deeper connection to our shared humanity and our roles as stewards of this beautiful planet. Luckily, I am not the only person who holds this view, as today's guest has dedicated her entire life to actualizing this pursuit. As joining us on the show today is the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, Osprey Orielle Lake. Through We Can, she works nationally and internationally with grassroots, indigenous and business leaders, policymakers, and scientists to promote climate justice, resilient communities, and a just transition to a clean energy future. For this conversation, we explore some of the central themes of her newest book, The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. Namely, we explore how some of our culture's foundational components of its worldview are at the root cause of many of the issues facing our planet. We then talk about what an alternative worldview could possibly look like. So this is a really meaty conversation that I think is so important for this current time in history, right on the advent of the year 2025, with all of the uncertainties that we're facing with the upcoming administration, which denies climate change. So really, it's such an incredible opportunity to sit down with this human. She's really quite the trailblazer with the quality of depth of her work, and I feel that this conversation highlights just how expansive her view is. It was a real treat to read through her newest book and to prepare for this, and ultimately to have the opportunity to pick her brain on these subjects. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed the whole process of studying and planning and then all the way up to the editing. If you want to stay in touch with her work going forward, you can head on over to wecaninternational.org and also consider picking up a copy of her book wherever you buy your books. The links to all of that stuff will be in the description. As always, if you want to support this show, patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism is the most direct and immediately felt way that you can do so. It costs a bit to keep a show like this running, especially for the 4 years that we've been doing it, and any and all little bit helps. So I see you, I thank you, I appreciate you. I am glad we were able to celebrate these conversations together. If money is a little tight right now, I totally understand. No pressure. You can also follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, or most effectively, subscribe over on YouTube, leave a comment, like the video, ring the bell for notifications. All of that stuff can help boost me in the algorithm and ensure that more people have access to this conversation, because it's conversations like the one we're having today that I feel are so needed in the discourse right now. And these people that I get to interview are just absolutely incredible, and Osprey is no different than that. She is truly a visionary, and I think a voice that many people could benefit from hearing. So that is what we're doing today. Thank you again so much for tuning in. I really appreciate your ears. I do not take it for granted. So without further ado, please sit back, drink some tea. You can maybe do some stretches, but whatever you do, most importantly, just open your heart for Osprey Orielle Lake. Okay, so we are now rolling. Osprey, hello. Welcome to the show. As always, I just want to start by saying thank you so much for giving me some of your time. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. And I actually just came back from a walk not too far from my home here in Northern California because there's been a lot of rains and the salmon runs have started. And it's always
Oh,
really an exciting time to see the rejuvenation of the salmon coming back.
that's amazing. So when you say rejuvenation, I guess I'm unfamiliar with what is going on in that region. Has there been kind of a dip in the population and what's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean it's a longer story, but the short version is, since colonization, since colonial settlers came to this region with urbanization and dams and logging and all sorts of things. The disruption of those salmon runs has been going on for a long time. And so, in more recent years, with tribal communities in the area and local environmentalists and conservationists, there's been a real attempt by the local communities to restore the river habitat and just be more conscious of how to care for the different streams here. And it has resulted in the different salmon coming back, which is just really exciting to see that when we put energy towards caring for nature, how fast the earth will respond. And I think that's something that I always am deeply awed by, respect, and is really important to what I think we all need to be doing at this time is how are we supporting the ecosystems around us and supporting the life systems.
Yeah. That's something that I think could really benefit a lot of people to hear that because I think right now, as I'm sure you know, we are in a time of great despair about the future of the planet and our politics. And just to know, I mean, even just as you're saying that, I felt like a little spark of hope come from that because it's just good news is out there. It's just kind of hard to find through sifting through the rubble of everything else. So I think that that's a pretty great thing to introduce in the first 2 minutes of the show. So thank you for that. Yeah. So I did tell you a little bit before we started recording, but I am about halfway through your book that released this year, and I have to say, wow, it is actually really remarkable. I've been completely blown away by just the depth that you've been able to go in that book, and the amount of threads that you're weaving in there is so skillful. And it really, every day, I feel like I'm learning something that's both, I mean, sobering. There's a lot of stuff in there that is very real and very immediate, and you feel a visceral sense of the precariousness of our current global situation with the climate and the environment. But I'm also, again, having so many sparks of hope, and you're putting so many things and so many initiatives on my map through there. And just the way you weave mythology and the activism and the art and the poetry. Uh, Congratulations! Really, it really.
Mhm.
I think it's an important work that everybody should pick up at some point. And it was kind of hard for me to dial in what I wanted to talk about because there's so much there, and I think each chapter is an episode in itself. But I think the umbrella that I'm picking up at the central channel that a lot of it is kind of feeding into is this notion that you explore pretty thoroughly of worldview and its importance when we address the climate crisis that we are facing. So for people who might not be familiar with this idea or might only know it superficially, I guess, what is worldview and why is it important that we acknowledge this as we face just the surmounting issues that we have as a global society?
Well, thank you, and thank you for your kind words about my book. Yeah, you know, because my daily work as executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN, we're very engaged on a daily basis from a wide range of angles addressing the climate crisis, everything from forest protection in Ecuador and Brazil and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We also do reforestation projects, women led reforestation projects. We do a lot of policy work. And a variety of advocacy. I just actually came back from Azerbaijan, where the COP29 UN climate talks have just completed. which was a very intense COP because it was focused on climate finance. So all this to say that a lot of, my daily work is very engaged with frontline communities and lifting up women's leadership and in very practical ways, and putting out a lot of fires and trying to do good work where we can and help with food security programs and all kinds of things. Within that context, I really wanted to take time in this book to go upstream, because I think, like many of us are aware, though all that work must happen, it's so immediate and people need help immediately and our ecosystems need attention immediately. Um, I think many of us have the sense that we would just exhaust ourselves endlessly running after all of these very serious, critical, life threatening challenges, which we need to do. But also, how do we actually look at the systems that cause these problems and begin to address them so that we're not just constantly running around trying to fix things, but actually get to root causes and begin to look at how do we actually have a deep systemic change that's transformational. And so for me, this is where the question of worldviews comes into play, not as just a philosophical exercise or intriguing or mystical, but actually as something that is a political strategy, that is a cultural strategy, that is a survival strategy. Because clearly, how we have been living, and when I say we, I mean the dominant culture, I don't mean everyone, certainly not intact indigenous cultures or local communities who have been living in harmony with nature, but I'm talking about at large, we as a dominant society have not been living well with each other or the earth for a very long time. And so, how do we start looking at what caused that? What are the root causes of that behavior? And so I think it is a very serious strategy to look at worldview. And what I mean by worldview is, what are our cosmologies? What are our understandings about how the world came into being? What are our codes of conduct? What are our ethics? What are our language systems? What is our mindset? How do we view our relationship to the earth and one another? And to be very tangible, some of the worldviews that I see that are very detrimental are, as an example, this idea of supremacy, whether that's white supremacy or patriarchy with men dominating over women, or racism, or when we look at this idea of dominion over nature. All these ideas of these hierarchies and dominion over cause an othering and a not belonging that has turned out to be a very dangerous course in the human adventure here on Earth. Because then there are people who are winning and people who are losing, or species that are winning and species that are losing out, instead of the fact that we're in this reciprocal, relational, egalitarian web of life together. And we've really lost that. And so, how these systems of hierarchy and supremacy then translate into things like racism, colonization, this idea of the extractive economy, where we can keep taking and taking from nature and from the earth as if there's not going to be a consequence, and no respect for planetary boundaries. And so, how do we actually look at these things within ourselves, and in our societal constructs? And I think both are really key, because it's not just moving the chess pieces on the board. It's actually also our internal behavior. And so worldviews also are very personal, and how they relate then to cultural components.
Yeah. So, in the nature of changing worldviews, I mean, as you just outlined all of that, there's something that kind of arose in me of the trickiness of it, because we are engaged in systems that we've created from these worldviews, and they're kind of feedback generating. So, like, these systems are actually shaping us as we develop and move forward. So, how do we initiate a change in worldview when the world that we're navigating is reinforcing and rewarding engagement with that worldview? What does it look like for an individual to exist within, say, capitalism, and try to bring about a new way of interacting with resources and community? And how does that work?
Yeah, that is such a wonderful, wonderful question. And I think one that faces all of us is that we want to transform a system that we're living in, and that we need to operate from, in very practical ways, just to, pay our rent and put food on the table. Like, these are very real things. And so I don't think we can just sort of wave a magical wand and then move from an extractive economy and capitalism into beyond growth or some other kind of economic structure. But we can go through the process, and I think that's what we're really looking at right now: is how do we have transformative policies? How do we have processes that are transformative for us personally? How do we actually look at where we want to go? So some of that work, I think, is also opening up our imaginations and having dialogues like we're having today, and I'm sure you have with many other people on your program. I think some of it has to do with taking the time to really imagine and design where it is that we want to go. And so what does this look like? It's seeing that we, on the one hand, are dismantling harmful structures, but also then looking towards what do we want to build and giving ourselves time and space to imagine that. And I think that's something that we have to recognize as part of our resistance to these systems of oppression, is to not let our have imagination stolen from us or restricted because, well, it's just not politically possible, so we can't think that. Well, at this stage, given the seriousness of where we are in the climate crisis, we know from many reports that right now, according to how governments are now planning the next years, in cahoots with the fossil fuel industry, we're going to head towards a 3-degree rise in global temperatures, which is uninhabitable for us and other living species. So I bring this point up of the urgency of that fact from science, because I think it's time to stop with incremental measures and understand that we're in a revolutionary moment where we have nothing to lose but to be as loving, outrageous, and bold, and clear in our determination, and fierce, and as kind and as extreme as we want to be. Because at this point, everything and everyone is needed. And so I think part of it is breaking out of the conformity of the moment and allowing ourselves to be in spaces that are fresh and new and allow us to not be confined by what our daily news is offering us, our daily politics are offering us, knowing that we have to still, of course, operate within the systems, but we have to create our own spaces of regeneration. Um, so those are sort of some big concepts, but in a very daily way, it can be revolutionary to grow a garden, to grow our own food systems. These acts can appear to be quite small, but it's profound. I know a lot of people during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that started gardening and growing their own food and haven't stopped. And the power is giving people to realize, wow, I could grow my own food and I can remove myself from other dependencies. So I think also some of these acts that might appear to be small, when you add them up, are quite transformative. People looking at how to get off the energy grid. So I really encourage people to, one, give ourselves space to imagine differently, think differently, be in nature more, listen to nature more, tell more stories, look at examples from Indigenous peoples who've been close to the land, and then act and take small acts every day. These are just like some beginning ideas, but I think this is how we begin step by step by step to really create resistance, but also dismantle the systems that are there and start intervening with new ways of being and thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, it seems as if one of the biggest hurdles isn't actually getting out there and doing something, but it is that process of starting to think differently. I think that that's where a lot of people, that's really where the seeds of change have to be planted, is in our own direct experience and how we relate to our existence, our expressions. And that's something that I think as this is just kind of my hypothesis, as things get a little bit more chaotic, I think it's going to put people in conditions that create a lot of novelty and opportunity to express differently. And that's something that I think we're going to all have to learn on an individual basis as we head into this next administration, because I think that it is going to disrupt so many different things. And I think the veil of safety and business as usual is kind of something of the past. And I think it's going to be immediately evident within probably 6 to 8 months just how on our own we truly are. And I think that that could actually have a reverberation that could be quite positive in the way that people relate to themselves and their community, and maybe even more so than COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that, you know, I think it's such a strange time because in some ways things are getting far, far worse with this new administration coming in. I mean, there's been so many conversations I've had, with my colleagues and the coalitions we're in. I mean, we are doing this work that is about transforming our current systems in a political landscape where it's going to be incredibly difficult to do that, and where we risk a lot of threat, actually. Um, and at the same time, I look to our sisters and brothers in the global South, who have been land defenders protecting the Amazon or other regions, who put their lives on the line every single day to protect their territories and to protect those forests for not just themselves, but for the whole world and the whole web of life to be sustainable. And so, I think that some of it is learning from other societies and cultures who have faced extreme regimes and learning about what kind of tactics and strategies were used and are being used to create ways forward even in very difficult times politically. um, and yes, I think we're heading into some incredibly harder times. It's already been hard, it's going to be harder. And at the same time, I agree with you. It's interesting because it also creates a quickening of people realizing that the systems we're in have already been oppressive. When I talk to a lot of my Indigenous colleagues, they're always sharing with me, like, for a lot of people, this is like the end of the world and what happens beyond the end of a world. And they always share with me, we already met the end of the world when colonization started. We've already been through the end of our world. And so this is another, rendition of an end of a world for many people who've already experienced so much hardship and colonization and uh, um, destruction to their communities and the way of life. So I think that this provides a sort of quickening of how are we going to act? How are we going to collect ourselves? And I think it will happen a lot at the local level, and at a subnational level, where we need to build out our communities. And one of the things that's really excited me about our work at Weekend is that some of our work, as I mentioned, is around these doing food sovereignty and food security with different communities. But that's sort of like a title. A lot of other things are happening in those spaces in terms of curating community and mutual aid and support systems as the climate crisis escalates. So that really inspires me, how to create these food sheds, and how they begin to create community around that for many, many other things that bring people together in a really good way and create workshops and people teaching each other skills and all kinds of things, and actually getting people closer to the land and closer to Mother Earth and getting a little bit more grounded. And that's a good thing. That part is a good thing, because I think in our overconsumption society and our way of living, which to me is really outsized and doesn't fit what nature can hold, nature is going to bat last, so to speak, and move us towards a more sustainability and ecological balance as she balances herself. And so while I am extremely concerned, especially for frontline communities who bear the brunt of political hardships as well as ecological hardships, um, I sincerely know that we need to remember who we are as human beings and remember our relationship with nature and how we're going to get grounded in living a very different way. It's going to be
Yeah.
difficult, but it's also necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, what strikes me is this notion of materialism as a strong point of our cosmology and our value system in terms of how much can we acquire seems to be something that drives kind of the entire Western enterprise. And that's something that I mean, if I pause and am honest with myself, it's what drives parts of my behavior as well. And I think that that's something that is, as resources and access to them start to change, I can see will be a challenge for people on an individual and collective level to reevaluate their relationship to how they find meaning, and learning how to get their sense of meaning from things that I think indigenous communities have actually already really mastered, and that's that relationship and reciprocity with the natural systems that they're kind of embedded within. But I think that that's going to be a process that I can see a lot of Western minds having to kind of undergo in letting go of the addiction to things and to money and to these external um, sources of prestige or what they are valuing. And I can just see that being a very important shift that we're going to have to make. And I think that the map for that is going to be from those indigenous communities, which you have also outlined pretty well in your book. And I've touched into a few other things this year that have just been kind of mind blowing and really shifting and illuminating for me. And I'm really excited for people to access that journey within themselves and see that process and decouple themselves from materialism as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and also, being vulnerable about your own experience with that, which I also share. I mean, I think all of us growing up in this society have that, and I think it ties into, again, this idea of worldview, and how, with this idea of um, sort of Western societies, dominant societies, having this idea of dominion over nature or being separate from nature, and that nature's here to serve us, versus that we're part of this incredible, magical cosmology of a living earth. That within that, we have also deeply hurt ourselves spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, in the sense that it creates an orphanage from belonging, an orphanage from the earth, an orphanage from being part of this animate, beautiful living earth. And I think within that comes this idea of materiality and consumerism and overconsumption, because there's this giant void of wanting to belong and wanting to fulfill our lives with meaning. And I think one of the things that has happened, and there's been many discussions on this that I think are really important, that we begin to fill ourselves up with things and stuff externally to deal with this feeling of orphanage and emptiness, because of a sense, it's not real, but a sense of disconnection, because we are nature. We can't be separate from the earth or the land or each other, the trees or the forests or the mountains. We are part of this great evolution on this planet. But this very detrimental worldview of being disconnected from nature, I think, is essential that we continue to unpack, that we really look at the root causes of it, and understand how dangerous it is that we have allowed ourselves in the dominant culture to feel disconnected from the Mother Earth and from a living web of life. And I think that's a source of a lot of how we have ended up in what many scholars are calling a polycrisis. Because as we start wanting more and more stuff, it really feeds capitalism. It feeds the idea of overconsumption, as we talked about. But also, I think we really lose our identity as a species of meaning making in terms of beauty making, of world tending, of all these other sorts of things that we can be to care for our ecosystems and the land, community making, myth making, storytelling, all of these ways that we can express ourselves as humans that actually take up a lot of space and a lot of time and are very fulfilling. Instead, people are, buying the new thing, or, watching the new television program or what have you, all of these external things that are, you know, uh, cause a lot of imbalance in the ecosystem, and an imbalance also in terms of wealthy people um, being able to exercise huge amounts of power over those who are not wealthy. And so it feeds into a lot of these systems of oppression that feed inequity, which is also part of the problem. And so I think we have to keep coming back to these root causes to really get at them. And because we're in such serious crises at many levels, at a societal level, at an ecological level, this is what I hope will drive us to these deeper questions. because ultimately we need to come to terms with ourselves and what is meaning and what is our connection to the land and what is our connection to the earth. Or, even you mentioning at the beginning of our conversation, how it was exciting for you to hear about the fish. For me too. I mean, people tend to think, oh, that's just, sort of maybe a quaint thing about these salmon, and nice that, this person went on a nature walk. But, truly, when I go on a walk like that, the whole world is there. The whole world, the whole universe of life opens up because I'm watching these fish. It's miraculous that they have returned. As an example, the coho salmon or the Chinook salmon, they go out into the Pacific Ocean. They go thousands of miles. And because of nature's mystery and intelligence, they know exactly which stream they were birthed from. They find their way back to that exact stream. They go up that stream to spawn and to spawn their eggs for the next generation. And in that process, um, the fish die. They use their last energy to go up and give birth to these eggs. And then they give away, they die as their last act. And those nutrients that they carry that are specific from the ocean, that they carry in their bodies, and feeds the streams and feeds those soils, which then generates the exact nutrients that the redwood trees and the other trees in that uh, ecosystem need to grow and flourish. So there's this whole circle that is going on, in the fact of this life, death, rebirth cycle that is going on. That's very cohesive and connected to each other. And I'm standing there as a human being watching this miraculous activity in real time. And so I think it's also about how do we become more present to what life is doing and not minimalize the fact that we live in this incredible living earth where these miracles of life are going on every single day. But how do we bring our attention back to this? And I'll just close by saying, I know there was a study that showed how young people are able to quickly look at some logo without the name on it and name easily 10 brand names and know exactly what that logo is as something they could purchase. But very few people, not just children, can go out their front door and name 10 plant species or birds that are literally outside their front door every day. No idea what those plants are, no idea what the bird is that's singing out the window, but they can name those consumer products. And right there, I think we can see the kind of contrast and the challenge that we're facing as we try to become different kinds of human beings right now.
Mm. Wow, that's a really potent example that kind of hit me a little bit. So this process that you're talking about reconnecting to the land and how we've kind of used consumerism as a little bit of a surrogate for our meaning making. And, that's really where a lot of our attention is at in that process of reconnecting to the land. How much of that is kind of innervated with the fact that we're all expats on this land? We're all kind of like a little bit of refugees from where our ancestors have been, and those relationships that they formed over thousands of years, which are baked into our genes. We don't really have access to that relationship that we once had to that land and how it has shaped our development. And I think we feel that. I think that that's also what kind of creates that sense of longing that we are replacing with products. So how do we? What does that look like for us as people who aren't from this land to form a connection with the land in a way that honors it and also honors the people that were here before us? And will that possibly feed us in the same way as if we were able to connect to where our ancestors have lived?
Yeah, I love the question. I think that I want to get at it in a few ways, but I also think we're in the process of doing it. I don't know if there's a precise answer to that question because I think that's the exact exploration we're in, and it's a really well articulated question. So, first of all, I think we need to, and for me, it's a very real practice to know the indigenous peoples of the lands we're on. I think number one, we need to regenerate respect. We need to cultivate that respect. Where am I living? Whose lands am I on? So I live in Coast Miwok territories here in Northern California. And I grew up on Pomo lands further north from here. And, for me, it's an ongoing process of learning about Indigenous peoples where I live, and not only seeing it as the past. What are Indigenous peoples who still live here doing right now? What are their needs? What are their campaigns? What are their requests? How do we support the Indigenous peoples whose territories we're on? Their lands have been stolen. We are on stolen lands, almost all of us, certainly here in the United States, but in regions around the world. And how do we support reparations? How do we support land back movements? This is very real. It's not in the past. Indigenous peoples are here still working to maintain their lands and steward their traditional territories. So I think that's, number one, how do we support Indigenous peoples who are here so we can be respectful visitors and add to the story, being furthering the the settler colonial project. Like, how do we begin to transform that relationship of colonization and being settlers on other people's lands? So I think that's number one, like dealing with the actual current crisis right in front of us, which is these stolen lands and reparations to Indigenous peoples, and how do we support Indigenous rights, which are violated all of the time. I mean, we work on many, many fights to stop fossil fuel pipelines from going through an extraction. And, very often these are happening on Indigenous lands, in Indigenous territories, or free, prior, informed consent, which is part of Indigenous rights, is violated on a daily basis. So we can go into some of those political fights we're engaged in, but they're very real. And so I think a big part of it is understanding where we live, who are the Indigenous peoples, what are their campaigns and needs, and how do we be respectful visitors on their territories, and contribute, not just like have land acknowledgement, but actually really get engaged and listen and learn respectfully and not co-opt. So that's the first thing. And then I think, there's a lot of homework to be done by all of us to be responsible to our own ancestries. And a lot of people, it's very difficult. There's a million reasons that people can't maybe find those historical threads. There's different ways. I mean, there's now you can find out about your DNA, and some of that's real and some of it may not be. I mean, we still are finding out how much science is behind all of this, but I think there's some of it, that merits paying attention to. We can talk to our grandparents. We can talk to, relatives about learning more about our ancestries. We can do research through libraries about where we know our families are from other countries in the world. Maybe some of us are fortunate enough, not everyone, to go visit lands where our ancestors lived. So there's a whole variety of things that we can do. And, if we're not able to travel there, we could certainly through email connect with people who live there. So there's so many different ways that we can begin to help ourselves to reconnect with our own ancestries. And I think it's a critical part of reclaiming our identities, which is also, again, about healing that void that we've been talking about that gets filled up in ways that are unhealthy. And so I think this is a really important part of being a responsible person, is to be present with our ancestries as much as we can be. And it may be a torn tapestry of broken threads, but there are things there that we all can learn from, and can really help us also then relate to Indigenous people who are here. Because if we show up completely empty, then we're really not creating a reciprocal force. And even if we show up with a story that is broken and damaged, then that's our story. That's the story. Or if we find in our ancestry that, our relatives were, colonizers who killed Indigenous people, then we have to own that story. So no matter what that story is, it's not about judging that story. It's about taking possession of that story, learning that story, you know, emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually encompassing that story, letting ourselves feel into that story and lean into that story and have that become a part of who we are. This is part of the healing process that we're in, to reweave this situation we're in, which you describe, which is we are on stolen land, on Indigenous people's land. We're not from our original lands, but we have to have some kind of process of reclamation and reparations and reweaving a brand new story out of what we were born into. And I know for me, which I wrote about in my book extensively, so I don't want to go too far, but I'll just share one story so that there's some practicality to this. In addition to, a lot of hardship, uh, I know that my family experienced from Ukraine with the pogroms of Jewish people living in Ukraine. My family came here 2 generations ago to escape um, the death squads that were in the area where they lived. But when they came here, again, without judging my elders, but their mindset was to survive. Their mindset wasn't, oh, we're coming to other people's lands. So there was never anything in my education about indigenous peoples and whose lands we're on, and no idea that what they had escaped is also what then they were starting to participate in. So that's my journey to help that. But I also learned a lot of things about, like, the the mixture of peoples I've come from. That it wasn't all so pure and tied up in a neat bow whatsoever. So my grandmother told me this story right before she died about how the village she had come from, a little bit north of uh, Kiev, um, her grandfather was in charge of the cavalry there, and he loved horses, and horses were like his whole life. And every year in that village at the springtime, they would honor the growing of the food. They were farmers, and they would want to do a ceremony, a ritual to ensure the good health of the crops. And so a young maiden was chosen every year to dress as like the spring maiden. And she would then, be in embroidered outfits and garlands in her hair. And she was walked around the fields on the best horse. And I heard the story because her grandfather got to lead the horse and pick the horse and dress the horse because he was in charge of the cavalry. So she told me this story. And then at the end of this ritual, they would plant these painted eggs into the ground as a symbol of, the egg of life and the fertility of the land. And it's a much longer story, but I'll leave it at that. But that really touched me. And, I've carried that tradition now when I garden of always planting painted eggs that I make, so that I'm bringing some of the story of where I come from in Ukraine to where I live now. And I've given some of these eggs to some of the indigenous elders that I've worked with and shared those stories. And so, it's just one example of how do we do this. I don't think anybody knows exactly how to do this, but I think we have to get into the exploration of it so that we bring as much of our land-based knowledge with us and sit respectfully at the feet of indigenous peoples where we now live and learn from them, respect their traditions, and try to bring our full selves to this condition that we are all in, of both being colonizers and having been colonized ourselves. And trying to unravel that story together, I think, is the best that we can do.
Yeah. Wow, that's wonderful. Yeah, that kind of brings me to something that I've really appreciated about your book, and that is the importance that you place on the role of stories and how stories can bind us to our ancestry, but also the land itself. And I guess for the people who are tuning into this who might want to begin this work, yeah, how would you describe the role of stories in this work of reclaiming who we are, and why are stories actually important rather than just kind of this thing that we just kind of, yeah, that's fun? Like, why is this actually a crucial part of this process?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, stories are so important because we are generating our words from stories. We are generating our realities from the stories we tell ourselves. And even as we were talking about earlier, before we started the program, about words themselves matter. They're in many ways an incantation of generating our world. And so words that we choose to use, the stories that we tell, are in fact how we make our world. And so, how we examine these stories and what stories we tell matter hugely. We can think back to our childhood and the stories that were told to us and how we formed our lives around those stories. So, we can never underestimate the power of narrative. and storytelling. And I would also even add in history, and the historical referencings that we have, and relating to what we were just talking about with reclaiming our ancestries. I mean, one thing too that's been very healing for me is to go back to what I call our pre-colonized, pre-patriarchal ancestors. And one of the ways that we can do that is through research into ancient histories. So, as an example, I've been able to research, locations where my ancestors lived and learn about the goddess people who lived there, people who were close to the land, who were their deities, how did they relate to the earth, and all those stories and mythologies have been hugely important to me to understand that, okay, I come from a colonizer people, but also people who have been colonized. But what was before that? So that there can be deep healing of my own relationship to my own indigeneity to a place before colonization, before patriarchy. And this is really important, not to bypass the current crisis or the current responsibilities I hold, but to give me a place to land and give any of us who do this research a place to land that's healthy and whole. Not perfect. There's never any perfect time, but a place where there was balance as a human being in my own ancestry with the land. And I think that's a critical point, because if we keep looking at our histories and all we see is, more conquest and, destruction and extractivism, it's really hard to feel well. So we need to own all of that, take responsibility for all that, but we also need to do some deep history. And those stories can be very profound. And I share some of them in my book as well. And, some of the beautiful artifacts I found that brought me enormous sort of visceral, embodied experiences of connecting with the land. And I think we need all of that to sort of retrace and reclaim and regenerate who we are. And that is the new story we're really searching for.
Yeah, I would agree. You had mentioned in that the role of the patriarchy, and this is something I wanted to cover. I know we're at 40 minutes, and that is an episode in itself, but it is something I want to touch on because I think it's so important for this current time, especially with the way that this last election went. I'm really recognizing, as I pay attention to news and people's analysis of how Trump could have possibly won. And one of the big things is that young men in large hordes kind of went to this figure who is largely, I guess, what some may call like a toxic masculine figure. And I think the work that you're doing by really exploring the patriarchy and all of its history and how, with the story of Gilgamesh and like its ancient roots and how it took hold, I think it's so important that we all understand that as a society, and also what its counter is with like the goddess religions and the seeing nature as feminine and honoring that. But what I'm curious about in this current moment, because I think it's important that we all come to that kind of understanding, but it's so politicized at this point. Even the word patriarchy has kind of been memeified and it's largely really dismissed. So I'm kind of curious how we invite young men in particular to the table to have this kind of dialogue when it's so politicized and it's so, a lot of people are so averse to it that they're going to be so resistant, but there's so many of them that are resistant. How do we start that kind of dialogue in a way that invites them in rather than allows them to go to the other table of this conservative, ultra extreme right movement? If that makes sense. Like, how do we, yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really very challenging. I mean, remember the day after the election, there was trending on social media was something that really chilled me to the bone. Um, your body, my choice. Men trending, your body, my choice.
Yeah.
I mean, that is chilling for so many women to be seeing that, and for young men to be thinking that. And it is terribly unfortunate that we have polarized, especially here in the United States, but other countries too. But let's just talk about here in the United States. This polarization has become so extreme. Um, and very, very scary and very violent. It has been, it's just bubbling more and more to the surface. It's not like it hasn't been here. But I think that people really underestimate, this the imbalance of the female and the male, and I would also add in, gender diversity as well. I mean, we're not just talking about binaries, but gender overall is a topic that is very divisive and very has been made to be so politicized, as you're saying, that it's very difficult to have conversations about any of this, because it's like you're picking a politics instead of just talking about being a human being, being a human being. And I think this is the way that we have to begin to get back at the conversation, is to move ourselves away from, a political discourse and attacks on gender, into a conversation about what does it mean to be a human being. And I'm almost getting emotional enough to cry right now, because I'm very upset about the fact that things have become so disjointed and disconnected, that we have lost the idea that people are human beings on the earth who basically want the same things. They want love, they want to belong, they want family and friends, they want shelter, they want food, they want to have time in nature, they want love. I mean, these basic things is really what we're talking about. And instead, we're having conversations about identity, and identity creating barriers to people allowing everyone just to be,
Mm.
and it turning into a political process of us and them, and ultimately a great deal of fear, and a great deal of fear about these hierarchies that we talked about earlier that are so dangerous, the worldview of hierarchies, instead of everyone being in reciprocity and in an egalitarian society. So the violence becomes extreme because nobody wants to be at the bottom of that hierarchy, because we know what happens then that discrimination causes physical harm, violence, starvation, being poor. I mean, everything negative we can think of, not having health care. So the scramble to the top of the hierarchy also is generating, a lot of this fear of white supremacy, of male dominance over women and gender diverse people, because we've created a system in which there's winners and losers. And so everybody's scrambling to the top and terrified that they're going to end up on the bottom. And this is a big oversimplification, but I'm just, in the short time we have, just trying to
Hmm.
say that we need to move back into egalitarian societies, back into balance with one another. And I don't think we're going to get at it by attacking one another. There has to be spaces where we're talking about the rights of being a human being, the
Yeah.
right to live and just have basic dignity. I think that's where the conversation has to begin, and that we need to decrease the sense of hierarchy, because then people are constantly scrambling to be more than or better than and other than. And so, I'm kind of condensing a lot of concepts here,
Yeah.
but I think it's where we need to begin, is how can we get into a conversation about what it is to be a human being.
Yeah. So I guess just for clarification, is the implication there that because the conversation for there's like equal rights and like really emphasizing, specifically like BIPOC folks and especially women, are you kind of implicating that that is kind of feeling threatening to the people who are on the hierarchy, who are like white cis males who might be at the top? Is it that causes a threat because it challenges their role in the hierarchy, and that's what creates fear and the aggression?
I think that's one piece of it. Yes, I'm definitely seeing that. I think that's one piece of it, one component. I think also another component of it is what we were talking about earlier, which is this disconnect from nature. Again, I think there's, in the same way that we have overconsumption, I think we have also created these identities that people cling on to, because what if you didn't have that, and you don't have a connection to nature or some other um, uh, connection to belonging? Then you create these identity groups that then become very fierce, and need to become more and more extreme, because what if there's nothing else? Which is not true, but our culture is not very good at cultivating relationship, relationship with the land, relationship with communities, relationship with others. So, if the threat of your jobs being taken away by X, Y, or Z group, um, I think is also instigating a lot of this identity crisis, which turns into violence. And then we can never forget also that people are also fighting over land and home and shelter. So it's at a very deep survival level, and who's going to be in control, who's going to have wealth, and who's going to have power. That's what we're really talking about. And the fear that if we share equally and we share egalitarian in an egalitarian way, that can't work. Like, we're not modeling, we're not showing that everyone actually could live well.
Yeah.
People don't believe that. We've
Yeah.
not modeled it, we don't teach it. And so now we've got all of these systems of creating, groups and subgroups and identities, and um, violently protect them because of being threatened that you will be the loser.
Yeah. So I guess the second part of that, would you say that by connecting to nature, nature itself models egalitarianism and the ability that things are abundant? And I mean, what I feel is, I mean, I think nature is it's just such a regulating force for our nervous systems because I mean, millions of years of evolving in nature and being connected to the natural rhythms, and it's really only recently that we've been kind of screen bound and we're all in buildings and not really connecting with the environment around us. And I think that has an allostatic effect. I think that's 5% more stress. So it makes us a lot more likely to have a negative reaction to something that might be challenging. So I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you suggesting that nature, by connecting to it, can teach us that it's actually okay to be egalitarian and that
Yes,
it's the
yes. I,
example?
I think that's a good. I like, if you're going to make a little. I like your phrase. If you're going to put on bumper sticker, nature's teaching us it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
Like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's okay. So I like that. Yeah, I think that. I do think that us not connecting to nature really pulls us out of perspective and out of an understanding of our place in the greater cosmos. And it is incredibly detrimental. And I think it creates a society of terrific immaturity, because there's no respect for understanding that if we don't have water, we can't live. If we pass the planetary boundaries, we won't exist. And I do think that because people are not connected to nature, this idea that we're going to, go to Mars or go to some other planet or create some kind of um, artificial intelligence or some kind of technology that is going to save us is part of the patriarchal project and a certain kind of built-in arrogance of having dominion over nature, dominion over everything, and that it has really run its dangerous course, that is now creating death and destruction everywhere. And so I think that that disconnect from nature really creates, unfortunately, a deep immaturity and a deep arrogance that is quite violent. And I think this is where we are at. And so, yes, connecting to nature is huge because it shows us our place. And because we do, most societies, most people live in societies that are, urban. It's really easy to forget nature, or where does your water come from, or where does your food come from, or who's growing your food. And so that disconnect is so built in because most people are living in urban environments. It's even easier to forget that. And what one thing that is happening with the climate crisis is, as there's more storms, there's more droughts, there's more flooding, there's more fires. you know Nature is speaking her language. Nature is showing us what balance is. And these events, as they happen more and more, these shocks are going to be a very tough love teaching from nature, but will also bring us to nature.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating way of looking at it as seeing these big weather events as messages and has insights. And I'm a body worker by trade, so I deal with pain a lot. And it's kind of the same way that the body, I mean, when we experience pain, it's actually a message, and it has something within it that we can use um, to adapt our behavior. And one of my big things is teaching people to see pain as an invitation rather than something that's just happening to you and you being a victim. It's actually an opportunity for transformation, and it coming to awareness naturally brings pain. I think, once we wake up from being asleep, there's kind of a shock, because you start to see very clearly the ways in which you might not have been showing up to your life in a way. And that's, I think, what pain can kind of teach us. And yeah, it's just very interesting to see that parallel with the way that the body politic of the earth also communicates to its constituents, us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a lot of wisdom there. And Mother Earth is just trying to balance herself. She's not trying to kill people off. She's trying to manage, what we've given her. I did want to mention, because I think we're probably getting close to the end, as my guess.
Mhm.
I wanted to really thank you for this conversation, because you know, the work that I do sort of on a daily basis at weekend is very much in the advocacy realm and campaigning. As I mentioned, just got back from COP29, doing a lot of, deep work in the negotiations with governments. And why I wanted to mention that is that I want to encourage people, to go on this exploration with me, honestly, of how do we have the kind of conversations you and I are having right now, and bring that into our politics, into our civil society spaces, and into our campaigning, because I'm really interested in how we come from these very deep spiritual conversations, and conversations about our worldviews, as an example, and everything we've discussed. How does that actually translate into interventions in the current systems? It's something that I wrestle with every day, and I'm trying to work with every day, of translating, these other concepts to not avoid those conversations, because I do think that we need to not just be in our own silos. So I spend time with government leaders, I spend time with financial institution industry leaders, and I'm not speaking like we're speaking now, but I really work to bring different concepts about what is the just transition, what are indigenous worldviews about how we could care for the forests better, like translating these ideas into actual policy or policy briefs or campaigns. And I just wanted to mention that, because we didn't really have a political conversation here of that nature. It's a different political conversation, but I just want us to be open to bridging into different silos than we're used to being in, because I think part of this time is a lot of connecting with people that we wouldn't normally do so, because we need a strong ecosystem. And so that cross pollinating, I think, is really important. And I don't have all the answers. I'm just sharing that. And it just popped into my head to say, an invitation for people also to merge worlds, because we really need that right now.
Yeah. I'm giving you the poetry snaps. I think that that's a beautiful addition, and thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really easy, and I can speak to my own experience, like to have these kinds of conversations because they're just like a little bit more like sexy or presentable, but actually getting in and doing the work that you're talking about with legislation, talking to policymakers and financial institutions, like that's where a lot of the change is really going to take place in a more practical way. Like the sharing of ideas is a part of that. Just like a body, there's different organs that do different functions. But I think it's when, I mean, the organs have to communicate to the other organs in the body for there to be just proper metabolism. So I think that is actually why I'm having conversations like this on the show. Normally I'm talking about mindfulness or just wellness things, but it's stuff like this that I think is a part of living a meaningful, well, flourishing life. And yeah, thank you so much for bringing that into the equation, because it really is where I think we, as a global society, as a spiritual um, community, just whoever is out there listening, I think that that's the direction we should be going in, is into these more tricky spaces. So yeah, thank you for that.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, we are at that time. I mean, like I'm looking at my questions and it's like, oh, there was so much to still explore. But I think what we did cover was so important and actually exactly what we needed to talk about. But I do want to give you a little bit of space and to just share how people can stay in contact with you and maybe learn more about what you're doing with We Can, and just where they can find your book and just what you're up to these days.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been just such a delight to have this conversation with you. Well, people can go to our website, which is at WeCan, WECAN, and then the word international spelt out, wecaninternational.org. And then you can see a lot of the work that we're doing that I mentioned a little bit around reforestation, forest protection, and protecting land defenders, going to a lot of these UN climate talks, and intervening with different ideas around the just transition, and Indigenous rights. Rights of nature is a big component of our work. We didn't touch on that, but that's a wonderful topic that also can help us bridge worlds, doing work around rights of nature. So a lot of that work can be found on our website. And then my book is The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. And it's everywhere where books are sold, as they said. I never thought
Mhm.
I'd say that sentence, but it's everywhere where books are sold. So it's everywhere on the internet, and you know, um, it's a funny thing because it's not even that I want people to buy the book. It's that I want people to read the book and be in dialogue like we've had today. That's what
Mhm.
excites me.
Yeah.
Like I promote my book because I actually, you have an opportunity when you write to share all these ideas in depth. And for me, it's like an invitation for a conversation. So that's why I'm encouraging people to get my book, is because I want us to kind of wrestle with these things. And, it's a roadmap. I wrote a roadmap to be discussed, to be explored together, for other people to add in other ideas. And so it's more a book about an invitation of a conversation that I'm
Yeah.
really excited to have with folks. So thanks for letting me be able to share that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and just all the knowledge that you have on these subjects. It really has also been a treat for me as well. And since I'm not bound by modesty, I would say that I hope people buy the book because I think it deserves support. And I agree with the sentiment that it initiates a conversation and has really deepened my understanding of so many things that I am still probably going to be chewing on for the next year. So, again, thank you so much, Osprey, for joining me on the show.
Thanks so
Truly
much.
such a treasure. All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through until the end. Once again, that was Osprey Orielle Lake. You can follow her work over at wecaninternational.org to see all the new projects that she has cooking. You can also order a copy of her book, The Story is in Our Bones, wherever you order your books. And if you want to support this show, head on over to patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism. Consider signing up. It really helps. If money is not where your life is at right now, then follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, do the digital age shuffle. All right, y'all, that was it. So thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.